God damn it. Y'all, I don't even have like an emotional support hoodie. I'm going in this whole, like, I'm going in blind. I have no hoodie. I have no snacks, no tissues. No tissues. Like I have nothing right now. Where your emotional support at? Oh god. Alright, let's we're ripping the band-aid. Fuck it. Let's get into it. Alright, chapter. Fuck, I'm scared. I'm so scared. Honestly, it can't hurt that bad. Compared to Sam, I don't think anything could ever hurt that bad. It can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. Alright, let's start. Chapter 26. Kale hated hunting parties. Many of the lords could barely handle a bow, let alone be stealthy. It was painful to watch them, and the poor hounds bursting through the brush, trying to scatter game that the lords would miss anyway. Usually, just to get things over with, he would discreetly kill a few animals and then pretend Lord so-and-so had done it. But the king, Parrington, Roland, and Dorian were all out in the game park today, which meant he had to keep close to them. Whenever he rode close enough to the lords to overhear their laughing and gossiping and harmless scheming, he sometimes let himself wonder if that was how he would have wound up, had he not chosen this path. He hadn't seen his younger brothers in years. Had his father allowed Taryn to turn into one of these idiots? Or had his father sent him to train as a warrior, as all lords of Anil had done in the centuries after the wild mountain men had preyed upon the city on the Silver Lake? As Kale trailed behind the king, his new Asterian stallion earning many admiring and envious glances from the hunting party, Kale allowed himself to consider, for one heartbeat, what his father would make of Selena. His mother was a gentle, quiet woman, whose face had become a blurred memory in the years since he'd last seen her, but he still remembered her lilting voice and soft laugh and the way she'd sung him to sleep when he was ill. Even though their marriage had been arranged, his father had wanted someone like his mother, someone submissive, which meant that someone like Selena. He cringed to even consider his father and Selena in a room together. Cringed and then smiled, because that was a battle of wills that could go down in legend. "You're distracted today, Captain," the king said as he emerged from between the trees. He was massive. The king's size always surprised Kale for some reason. He was flanked by two of Kale's guards, one of which was Ress, who looked more nervous than triumphant at being selected to protect the king today, though he was trying his hardest not to show it. It was why Kale had chosen Danan, the other guard, older and weathered and processing near legendary patience. Kale bowed to his sovereign, and then gave Ress a slight nod of approval. The young guard sat up straighter, but remained alert, his focus now upon their surroundings, the lords riding nearby, the sounds of dogs and arrows. The king pulled his black horse alongside Kale's, falling into a meandering walk. Ress and Danan fell back at a respectable pace, still close enough to intercept any lurking threat. "Whatever will my lords do without you to kill their quarry for them?" Kale tried to hide his smile. Perhaps he hadn't been as discreet as he thought. "Apologies, my lord." Atop his war horse, the king looked every inch the conqueror he was. There was something in his eyes that sent a chill down Kale's spine, and made him realize why so many foreign rulers had offered him their crowns instead of facing him in battle. "I'm having the princes of Ilwi questioned in my council room tomorrow night," the king said quietly, enough that only Kale could hear, turning his stallion to follow the pack of hounds that rushed through the thawing woods. "I want 6 men outside the room. Make sure there are no complications or interruptions." The look the king gave him suggested exactly the sort of complication he had in mind. Selena. Kale knew it was risky to ask questions, but he said, "Is there anything specific that I should prepare my men for?" "No," the king said, knocking an arrow to his bow and firing at a pheasant that surged up from the bush. A clean shot, right through the eye. "That will be all." The king whistled to his hounds and followed after the prey he'd killed, Ress and Danan close behind. Kale stilled his stallion, watching the mountain of a man ride through the thicket. "What was that about?" Dorian said, suddenly beside him. Kale shook his head. "Nothing." Dorian reached over his shoulder to the quiver strapped there and drew an arrow. I haven't seen you for days. I've been busy. Busy with duties and busy with Selena. I haven't seen you around either. He made himself meet Dorian's gaze. Dorian's lips were pursed, his face stony as he quietly said, I've been busy too. The Crown Prince turned his horse away, heading in another direction, but paused. Cale, he said, looking over his shoulder. Dorian's eyes were frozen, his jaw clenched. Bye. Bye, because I love him so much. Treat her well. Dorian, he started, but the prince rode off to join Roland. Suddenly alone in the teeming forest, Cale watched his friend disappear. Cale didn't tell Selena what the king had said, though part of him twisted until it hurt. The king wouldn't hurt Nehemiah. Not when she was such a public and well-known, well-liked figure. Not when he'd warned Cale about that anonymous threat to Nehemiah's life. But he had a feeling that whatever was going to be said in the council room wasn't going to be pleasant. Selena knowing or not knowing made no difference, he told himself as he lay curled around her in his bed. Even if Selena knew, even if she told Nehemiah, it wouldn't stop the conversation from taking place, and it wouldn't make the nameless threat go away. No, it would just make things worse if they knew. Worse for all of them. Cale sighed, untangling his legs from Selena's as he sat up and grabbed his pants from where he'd thrown them on the floor. She stirred but didn't move. That was a miracle in and itself, he realized, that she felt safe enough to sleep soundly with him. He paused to gently kiss her head, then picked up the rest of his clothes from around the room and dressed, even though the clock had chimed only 3 not long ago. Perhaps it was a test, he thought as he slipped out of the door of his chambers. Perhaps the king was testing Cale to see where his loyalties lay. If he could still trust him. And if he learned that Selena and Nehemiah were aware of the interrogation tomorrow, then there would be only one way for them to have learned. He just needed some fresh air, to feel the briny breeze of the Avery on his face. He'd meant it when he told Selena about someday leaving Rifthold with her, and he'd go to his death defending her secret about the men she wasn't killing. To your death, huh? To your death? Cale reached the dark, silent garden and strode between the hedges. He'd kill any man who hurt Selena, and if the king ever gave him the order to dispatch her, then he'd plunge his sword into his own heart before he would obey. His soul was bound to hers by some unbreakable chain. He snorted, imagining what his father would think when he learned that Cale had taken Ardalan's assassin for his wife. The thought stopped Cale dead in his tracks. She was only 18. He forgot that sometimes. Forgot that he was older than her too. And if he asked her to marry him right now, God's above, he muttered, shaking his head. That day was long off. But he couldn't help imagining it. The glimmer of the future and how it would be to forge a life together, to call her his wife, to hear her call him husband, to raise a brood of children who would probably be far too clever and talented for their own good and for Cale's sanity. He was still envisioning that impossibly beautiful future when someone grabbed him from behind and pressed something cold and reeking against his nose. I need a second. Oh, I need a minute. Hold on. And the world went black. Hold on. No. Y'all, please tell me this. No. I know I said... No, stop. I know I said that he was going to die. But I really was only joking. Like, I was like, oh, he's gonna die. But in like a funny way. Like, I didn't mean for it to be taken literally. Oh, and this next chapter isn't even from his point of view. Y'all. No. Chapter 27. Cale wasn't in his fucking bed when she awoke, and Selena thanked the gods for their small mercies because she was certainly too worn out to bother running. Oh my god. I am not crying yet because it's I think I've seen this film before. And you know what? I didn't like the ending. If I ever run into SJM on the streets, if I ever see that bitch on the streets, it's on sight. It is on sight. His side of the bed was cold enough that she knew he'd left hours before, probably to fulfill his duties as captain of the guard. She lay there for a while, content to daydream, to imagine a time when they could have whole, uninterrupted days with each other. When her stomach started growling, she decided it was a sign that she should drag herself out of bed. She'd taken to leaving some clothes in his room, so she bathed and dressed before returning to her own chambers. Over breakfast, a list of names arrived from Archer, written in code as she'd asked, with more men to hunt down. She just hoped he wouldn't squeal on her again. Nehemiah didn't show up for their daily lessons on the word marks, though Selena wasn't surprised by that either. She didn't particularly feel like talking to her friend, and if the princess was foolish enough to think of starting a rebellion, she'd stay well enough away from Nehemiah until she came to her senses. It did halt her hope of finding a way to use the word marks to get through that secret door in the library, but that could wait. At least until both of their tempers had cooled. After spending the day in Rifthold, stalking the men on Archer's list, Selena returned to the castle, eager to tell Cale what else she'd learned. But he didn't show up for dinner. It wasn't unusual for him to be busy, so she dined alone and curled up on the couch in her bedroom with a book. She probably needed some rest, too, since the word knew she hadn't been getting any sleep this past week. Not that she minded. When the clock struck 10 and he still hadn't come to her, she found herself walking to his rooms. Perhaps he was waiting for her there. Perhaps he'd just fallen asleep without meaning to. But she hurried down the halls and stairs, her palms turning slicker with each step. Cale was captain of the guard. He held his own against her every day. He'd bested her in their first sparring match. Yet Sam had been her equal in many ways, too. Oh my god, I can't do this! I don't want to do this! I don't want to do this! Oh my god, I don't want to do this! Oh no! Oh my god. Y'all, oh please don't do this! Oh, I'm literally begging! Oh my god! I'm literally begging you, SJM, you're so sexy, don't do this! Oh. And he'd still been caught and tortured by Farron. Still died the most brutal death she'd ever seen. And if Cale... She was running now. Like Sam, Cale was admired by almost everyone. And when they'd taken Sam from her, it hadn't been because of anything Sam had done. No. They'd done it to get at her. She reached his rooms, part of her still praying that she was just being paranoid, that he'd be sleeping in the bed, that she could curl up with him and make love to him and hold him through the night. But then she opened the door to his bedroom and saw a sealed note addressed to her on the table beside the door. Placed atop his sword, which hadn't been there this morning. It was placed casually enough that the servants might have just assumed it was a note from Cale himself and that nothing was wrong. She ripped open the red seal and unfolded the paper. "We have the captain. When you're tired of stalking us, come find us here." It listed the address for a warehouse in the slums of the city. "Bring no one, or the captain will die before you set foot in the building. If you fail to arrive by tomorrow morning, we'll leave what's left of him on the banks of the Avery." She stared at the letter. Every one of the restraints she'd locked into place after she'd rampaged through Endovir snapped free. An icy, endless rage swept through her, wiping away everything except the plan that she could see with brutal clarity. The killing CoM, Arab and Hamel had once called it. Even he had never realized just how calm she could get when she went over the edge. If they wanted Ardalan's assassin, they'd get her, and word helped them when she arrived. There, she's over the edge. She's over the edge. She's over the edge. She's over the edge. And this is it. That's what they wanted. That's what they wanted. So she's over the edge, and we don't need to kill Cale, and they can live happily ever after, and that's that. Kale didn't know why they'd chained him up. Oh, thank God he's still alive. Oh, God, Jesus Christ. Oh, jeez. That's not funny. That was not funny. This bitch really had me going for a second. I was really going for it. This man's alive. I'm good. Kel didn't know why they chained him up, only that he was thirsty and had a pounding headache, and that the irons holding him against the stone wall weren't going to budge. They threatened to beat him every time he tried pulling against them. They'd already knocked him about enough to convince him that they weren't bluffing. He didn't even know who they were. They all wore long robes and hoods that concealed their masked faces. Some of them were armed to the teeth. They spoke in murmurs, all of them growing increasingly on edge as the day passed. From what he could tell, he had a split lip and would have some bruises on his face and ribs. They hadn't asked questions before unleashing 2 of their men on him, though he hadn't been entirely cooperative once he'd awoken and found himself here. Selena would be impressed by just how creative his curses had been before, during, and after that initial beating. In the passing hours, he'd moved only once to relieve himself in the corner, since when he asked to use the washroom, they just stared at him, and they'd watched him the entire time, hands on their swords. He tried not to snort. They were waiting for something, he realized, with a strange clarity as the day stretched into evening. The fact that they hadn't killed him yet suggested that they wanted some sort of ransom. Maybe it was a rebel group, seeking to blackmail the king. He'd heard of nobility being captured for that reason, and heard the king himself ordered the rebels to kill the petty lord or lady because he would not yield to traitorous filth. Kale didn't allow himself to consider that possibility, even as he began saving up his strength for whatever stand he'd make before he met his end. Some of his captors whispered in rapid arguments, but they were usually silenced by others who told him to wait. He was just pretending to doze off when another of the arguments occurred, a hissing back and forth about whether they should just free him, and then, "She has until dawn. She'll show up." She. That word was the worst thing he'd ever heard, because there was only one she who would bother to show up for him. One she that he could be used against. "You hurt her," he said, his voice hoarse from a day without water, "and I'll rip you apart with my bare hands." There were 30 of them, half fully armed, and they all turned to him. He bared his teeth, even though his face ached. "You so much as touch her, and I'll gut you." One of them, tall, with 2 swords crossed over his back, approached. Even though his face was obscured, Kale recognized him by his weapons as one of the men who had beaten him earlier. He stopped just beyond where Kale's feet could kick. "Good luck with that," the man said. By his voice, he could have been anywhere from 20 to 40. "You'd better pray to whatever gods you favor that your little assassin cooperates," he growled, pulling against the chains. "What do you want from her?" The warrior. He was a warrior. Kale could tell by the way he moved, cocked his head. "None of your business, Captain. And keep your mouth shut when she arrives, or else I'll cut your filthy royal tongue." Another clue. The man hated royals, which meant that these people... Motherfucker, is that Arabin? Had Archer known how dangerous this rebel group was, when he got free, he'd kill him for letting Selena get tangled up with them. And then he'd make sure that the king and his secret guards got their hands on all of these bastards. Kale yanked on the chains and the man shook his head. "Do that and I'll knock you out again. For the captain of the Royal Guard, you were far too easy to capture." Kale's eyes flashed. "Only a coward captures men the way that you did." "A coward or a pragmatist?" "Not an uneducated warrior, then. Someone with schooling, if you could use vocabulary like that." "How about a damn fool?" Kale said. "I don't think you realize what you're dealing with." The man clicked his tongue. "If you were that good, you would be more than the captain of the guard." Kale let out a low, breathy laugh. "I wasn't talking about me. She's just one girl." Okay, it's not Arabin. Though his guts were twisting at the thought of her in this place with these people, though he was considering every possible way to get himself and Selena out of here alive, he gave the man a grin. "Then you're really in for a surprise." Chapter 28. Her rage took her to a place where she only knew 3 things: that Kale had been taken from her, that she was a weapon forged to end lives, and that if Kale was hurt, no one was going to walk out of that warehouse. She made it across the city quickly and efficiently, a predator's stealth keeping her steps quiet in the cobblestone streets. They told her to arrive alone, and she'd obeyed. But they hadn't said anything about arriving unarmed. So she'd taken every weapon she could fit onto her, including Kale's sword, which was strapped across her back with a second sword of her own, the two hilts within easy reach over her shoulders. From there down, she was a living armory. When she neared the slums, her features concealed with a dark cloak and a heavy hood, she scaled the side of a ramshackle building until she reached the roof. They hadn't said anything about using the front door of the warehouse either. She stalked across the roofs, her supple boots finding easy purchase on the crumbling emerald shingles, glistening, watching, feeling the night around her. The usual sounds of the slums greeted her as she approached the enormous 2-story warehouse. Half-feral orphans screeching to each other, the splatter of drunks pissing against buildings, harlots calling out to prospective hires. But there was a silence around the wooden warehouse, a bubble of quiet that told her the place had enough men out front that the usual slum denizens stayed away. The nearby rooftops were empty and flat, the gaps between buildings easily jumpable. She didn't care what this group wanted with her. She didn't care what sort of information they expected to twist from her. When they had taken Kale, they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. The last mistake, too. She reached the roof of the building beside the warehouse and dropped into a crawl before she reached the ledge and peered over. In the narrow alley directly below, 3 cloaked men patrolled. On the street beyond lay the front doors of the warehouse, light spilling from the cracks to reveal at least 4 men outside. No one was even looking at the roof. Fools. The wooden warehouse was a giant open space 3 stories high, and through the open second-level window in front of her she could see all the way to the floor below. The mezzanine wrapped around much of the second level, and stairs led onto the third level and roof beyond. The possible escape route and the front door wasn't an option. 10 of the men were heavily armed, and 6 archers were positioned around the wooden mezzanine, arrows all pointed at the first floor below. There was Kale, chained to one of the wooden walls. Kale, his face bruised and bleeding, his clothes ripped and dirty, his head hanging between his shoulders. The ice in her gut spread through her veins. She could scale the building to the roof, then come down from the 3rd floor. But that would take time, and no one was looking at the open window before her. She tipped her head back and gave the moon a wicked smile. This is not gonna go well. The last time this bitch jumped through a window because she thought it was a safe bet, it ended up with her going to Enderveer. She'd been called Ardalan's assassin for a reason. Dramatic entrances were practically her art form. Selena eased back from the ledge and strode away a few paces, judging how far and fast she'd need to run. The open window was wide enough she wouldn't need to worry about shattering glass or her swords catching on the frame, and the mezzanine had a guardrail to stop her if she overshot her landing. She had made a jump like this once before, on the night when her world had been shattered completely. But on that night, Sam had already been dead for days, and she'd leapt through the window of Rorik Farron's house for pure revenge. This time, she wouldn't fail. The men weren't even looking at the window when she hurtled through, and by the time she landed on the mezzanine and rolled into a crouch, 2 of her daggers were already flying. Kale caught the glint of moonlight on steel in the heartbeat before she leapt through the 2nd-level window, landing atop the mezzanine and hurling 2 daggers at the archers nearest her. They went down, and she went up, 2 more daggers thrown at 2 more archers. He didn't know if he should watch them or watch her as she gripped the mezzanine railing and flipped over it, landing on the ground below just as several arrows struck where her hands had held the rail. The men in the room were shouting, some fleeing for the safety of pillars and the exit, while others rushed at her, weapons drawn, and he could only watch in horror and awe as she drew 2 swords, one of them his, and unleashed herself upon them. They didn't stand a chance. In the fray of bodies, the remaining 2 archers didn't dare loose arrows that might hit one of their own, another intentional move on her part, he knew. Kale yanked on his chains again and again, his wrists aching. If he could just get to her, the 2 of them could. She was a whirlwind of steel and blood. As he watched her cut through the men as though they were stalks of wheat in a field, he understood how she had gotten so close to touching Endevir's wall that day. And at last, after all these months, he saw the lethal predator he'd expected to find. Sorry, I lost my spot. In the mines. There was nothing human in her eyes, nothing remotely merciful. It froze his heart. The guard who had been taunting him all day remained nearby, twin swords drawn, waiting for her. One of the hooded men had gotten far enough away from her to start shouting, "Enough! Enough!" But Celaena didn't listen, and as Chaol hurled himself forward, still trying to dislodge the chains from the wall, she cleared a path through the men, leaving moaning bodies in her wake. To his credit, his tormentor stood his ground as she stalked toward him. "Don't shoot," the hooded man was ordering the archers. "Don't shoot!" Celaena paused in front of the guard, pointing a blood-drenched sword at him. "Get out of my way, or I'll cut you to pieces." His guard, the fool, snorted, lifting his swords a little higher. Is it Arabin? I'm scared. I'm scared. Is it Arabin? Is it I'm scared. I'm scared. I'm scared. His guard, the fool, snorted, lifting his swords a little higher. "Come and get him." Celaena smiled, but then the hooded man with the ancient voice was rushing to them, arms spread to show he wasn't armed. "Enough! Put down your weapons, he told the guard. The guard faltered, but Celaena's words remained at the ready. Oh no, it's not Arabin. The old man took one step toward Celaena. "Enough! We have enough enemies as it is. There are worse things out there to face." Celaena slowly turned to him, her face splattered with blood and eyes blazing bright. "No, there aren't," she said, "because I'm here now." Blood that was not her own drenched her clothes, her hands, her neck, but all she could see were the archers ready on the mezzanine above her, and the foe still standing between her and Chaol. Her Chaol. "Please," the hooded man said, pulling off his hood and mask to reveal a face that matched his ancient voice. Short-cropped white hair, laugh lines around his mouth, and crystal-clear gray eyes that were wide with pleading. "Perhaps our methods were wrong, but..." She pointed a sword at him, and the masked guard between her and Chaol straightened. "I don't care who you are and what you want. I'm taking him now." "Please, listen," the old man said softly. She could feel the ire and aggression rolling off the hooded guard in front of her, see how tightly, eagerly he clutched the hilts of his twin swords. She wasn't ready for the bloodletting to end either. She wasn't ready to give in at all. So she knew exactly what would happen when she turned to the guard and gave him a lazy grin. He charged, and she met his swords. The men who were outside burst in, steel flashing. And then there was nothing but metal ringing and the shouts of the injured going down and around her, and she was soaring through them, delighting in the feral song that sang through her blood and bones. Someone was shouting her name, though, a familiar voice that wasn't Chaol's. And as she turned, she saw a flash of a steel-tipped arrow shooting for her, then a glint of golden-brown hair, and then Archer hit the ground, the arrow that was meant for her in his shoulder. It took all of 2 movements to drop one sword and draw the dagger from her boot, hurtling at the guard who had fired. By the time she looked at Archer, he was getting to his feet, putting himself between her and the wall of men, one arm splayed in front of her, facing her, protecting the men. "This is a misunderstanding," he said to her, panting. Blood from the wound in his shoulder leaked down his black robes. Robes? The same robes that these men wore. What the fuck is going on? Archer was a part of this group. Archer had set her up. And then that rage, the rage that blurred the events of the night she'd been captured with the events of this night, that made Chaol's and Sam's faces bleed together, seized her so fiercely that she reached for another dagger strapped to her waist. "Please," Archer said, taking a step toward her, wincing as the movement made the arrow shift. "Let me explain." As she saw the blood trickle down his robes, saw the agony and fear and desperation in his eyes, her rage flickered. "Unchain him," she said, her voice filled with deadly calm. "Now." Archer refused to break her stare. "Hear me out first. Unchain him now." Archer jerked his chin to the guard who had foolishly launched the last attack against her. Limping, but surprisingly still in one piece and still possessing his twin blades, the guard slowly unshackled the captain of the guard. Chaol was on his feet in an instant, but she noted the way he swayed, the wince he tried to hide. Still, he managed to stare down the hooded guard who stood before him, eyes gleaming with the promise of violence. The guard just stepped back, reaching for his sword again. "You have one sentence to convince me not to kill you all," she said to Archer as Cale came to her side. "One sentence." Archer began shaking his head, looking between her and Cale, his eyes filled with not fear or anger, but pleading. Or pleading, but sorrow. "I've been working with Nehemiah." Huh? I've been working with who? I've been working with Nehemiah? "To lead these people for the past 6 months. Cale stiffened, but Selena blinked. It was enough for Archer to know he'd passed the test. He jerked his head to the men around him. "Leave us," he said, his voice thundering with an authority she hadn't heard him use before. The men listened, those still on their feet dragging their injured companions away. She didn't let herself consider how many were dead. The old man who had exposed his face to her was staring with a mixture of awe and disbelief, and she wondered what sort of monster she looked at that moment. But when he noticed her attention, he bowed his head to her and left with the others, taking that impulsive, brash guard with him. Alone, she pointed her sword at Archer again, taking a step closer, keeping Cale behind her. Of course, the captain of the guard stepped right up to her side. Archer said, "Nehemiah and I have been leading this movement together. She came here to organize us, to assemble a group that could go into Terrasen and take gathering forces against the king. And start gathering. And to uncover what the king truly plans to do to Aurelia." Cale tensed, and Selena clamped down on her surprise. "That's impossible," Archer snorted. "Is it? Why is it that the princess is so busy all the time? Do you know where she goes at night?" The frozen rage flickered again, slowing the world down. And then she remembered how Nehemiah convinced her not to look into the riddle she'd found in Davis's office, and had been so slow and forgetful about her promise to research the riddle. Remembered the night Dorian had come to her rooms because Nehemiah had been out, and he hadn't been able to find her anywhere in the castle. Remembered Nehemiah's words to her before their fight, about how she had important matters in Rifthold to look after, things as important as Ilwi. She comes here," Archer said. "She comes here to feed us all of the information that you confide in her." "If she's a part of your group," Selena ground out, "then where is she?" Archer drew his sword and pointed it at Cale. "Ask him." "Huh? What?" A sharp pain twisted in her gut. What is he talking about?" she asked Cale, but Cale was staring at Archer. "I don't know." What is going on? What is happening?" "Lying bastard," Archer snapped, and bared his teeth with a savagery that made him, for once, look anything but attractive. "My sources told me that the king informed you over a week ago of the threat to Nehemiah's life. When were you planning on telling anyone about that?" "Oh, this is it. Oh my god, this is it. Oh my god, this is it." Sorry, my phone was dying. That's why it's buffering. If it's buffering for y'all. Oh my, what did I tell y'all? What did I tell y'all? They should have killed him. They should have killed him. Oh, they should have killed him. He turned to Selena, sorry. "We brought him here because he was ordered to question Nehemiah about her behavior. We wanted to know what kind of questions he'd been commanded to ask, and because we wanted you to see what sort of man he truly is." "That's not true," Cale spat. "That's a damned lie. You haven't asked me one thing, you gutter-born piece of filth." He turned pleading eyes to Selena. The words were still sinking in, each more awful than the next. "I knew about the anonymous threat to Nehemiah's life. Yes, but I was told that she would be questioned by the king, not me." "And we realized that," Archer said. "Moments before you arrived, Selena. We realized the captain wasn't the one. But it's not questioning that they're going to be doing tonight, is it, Captain? I don't hate him. I'm sorry. I was mad because I was mad that I was right about this being the big thing that would come between him and Selena. Kale didn't answer, and she didn't care why. She was pulling away from her body, inch by inch, like a tide ebbing from the shore. I just sent men to the castle a moment ago. Perhaps they can stop it. Where's Nehemiah? She heard herself asking, from lips that felt far away. That's what my spy discovered tonight. Nehemiah insisted on staying in the castle, to see what kind of questions they wanted to ask her, to see how much they suspected and knew. Where is Nehemiah? But Archer just shook his head, his eyes bright with tears. They aren't going to question her, Selena. And by the time my men get there, I think it'll be too late. Too late. Selena turned to Kale. His face was stricken and pale. Archer shook his head again. I'm sorry. Goddamn. Goddamn. Oh, goddamn. Oh, goddamn. Oh, goddamn it. Oh, I didn't want to be right. Oh. I don't know who I would have rather died. Oh, God, chapter 29. Selena hurtled through the city streets, discarding her cloak and heavier weapons as she went. Anything to give her additional speed. Anything to get her back to the castle before Nehemiah. A clock began sounding somewhere in the capital, and a lifetime passed between each booming peal. It was late enough that the streets were mostly deserted, but the people who saw her kept well out of her way as she sprinted past, her lungs nearly shattering. She pushed that pain away, willing strength into her legs, praying to whatever god still cared to give her swiftness and strength. Who would the king use? If not Kale, then who? She didn't care if it was the king himself. She'd destroy them. And that anonymous threat to Nehemiah, she'd sort that out too. Is it Arabin? The glass castle loomed closer. Its crystalline, I don't know, towers glowing with a pale greenish light. Not again, not again, she told herself with each step, each pound of her heart. Please. She couldn't take the front gate. The guards there would surely stop her or cause a ruckus that might prompt the unknown assassin to act faster. There was a high stone wall bordering one of the gardens. It was closer and far less monitored. She could have sworn she heard hooves thundering after her, but there was nothing in the world except her and the distance to Nehemiah. She neared the stone wall surrounding the garden, her blood roaring in her ears as she made a running jump for it. She hit the side as silently as she could, her fingers and feet immediately finding purchase, digging in so hard her fingernails cracked. She scrambled up and over the wall before the guards even looked her way. She landed on the gravel path of the garden, falling onto her hands. Somewhere in the back of her mind she registered pain in her palms, but she was already running again, careening toward the glass doors that led to the castle. Patches of snow glowed blue in the moonlight. She'd go to Nehemiah's room first, go there and lock Nehemiah up safely, and then take down the bastard who was coming for her. Archer's men could go to hell. She dispatched them in a matter of heartbeats. Whoever had been sent to hurt Nehemiah, that person was hers to take apart bit by bit until she ended them. She would throw their remnants at the feet of the king. She flung open the glass doors. There were guards loitering about, but she picked this entrance because they knew her and knew her face. She didn't expect to glimpse Dorian, though, chatting with them. His sapphire eyes were nothing more than a glimmer of color as she sprinted by. She could hear shouts from behind her, but she wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not again. Never again. Oh God. Oh God, part 2. What is this? Why is that there? She hit the stairs, taking them by 2s and 3s, her legs trembling. Just a bit farther. Nehemiah's rooms were only one level up and 2 hallways over. She was Ardalan's assassin. She was Selena Sardathian. She would not fail. The gods owed her. The word owed her. She would not fail Nehemiah. I'm gonna cry. Not when there were so many awful words left between them. Selena hit the top of the stairs. The shouts behind her grew. People were calling her name. She would stop for no one. She turned down the familiar hallway, nearly sobbing with relief at the sight of the wooden door. It was shut. There was no signs of forced entry. She drew her 2 remaining daggers, summoning the words she'd need to quickly explain to Nehemiah how and where to hide. When her assailant arrived, Nehemiah's only task would be to keep quiet and concealed. Selena would deal with the rest, and she'd enjoy the hell out of it. She reached the door and slammed into it, exploding through the locks. The world slowed to the beat of an ancient, ageless drum. Selena beheld the room. Selena beheld the room. There was blood everywhere. Before the bed, Nehemiah's bodyguards lay with their throats cut from ear to ear, their internal organs spilling out onto the floor. And on the bed, she could hear the shouts growing closer, reaching the room, but their words were somehow muffled, as though she were underwater, the sounds coming from the surface above. Selena stood in the center of the freezing bedroom, gazing at the bed and the princess's broken body atop it. Nehemiah was dead. God. Part 2. The Queen's Arrow. Selena stared at the body. Oh my god. I'm sorry, y'all. I was trying to hold it together and I couldn't. I'm so mad. Selena stared at the body. An empty body, artfully mutilated. Why does everything have to be so painful? So cut up that the bed was almost black with blood. People rushed into the room behind her, and she smelled the faint tang as someone was sick nearby. She just stayed there, letting the others fan out around her as they rushed to assess the 3 cooling bodies in the room. That ancient, ageless drum, her heartbeat pulsed through her ears, drowning out any sound. Nehemiah was gone. That vibrant, fierce, loving soul, the princess who had been called the light of Ilwi, the woman who had been a beacon of hope, just like that. As if she were no more than a wisp of candlelight, she was gone. When it mattered most, Selena hadn't been there. Nehemiah was gone. Someone murmured her name, but didn't touch her. There was a gleam of sapphire eyes in front of her, blocking out her vision of the bed and the dismembered body atop it. Dorian. Prince Dorian. There were tears running down his face. She reached out a hand to touch them. They were oddly warm against her freezing, distant fingers. Her nails were dirty, bloody, cracked, so gruesome against the smooth white cheek of the prince. And then that voice from behind her said her name again. Selena. They had done this. Her bloody fingers slid down Dorian's face, to his neck. He just stared at her, suddenly still. Selena, that familiar voice said. A warning. They had done this. They had betrayed her. Betrayed Nehemiah. They had taken her away. Her nails brushed Dorian's exposed throat. Selena, the voice said. Selena slowly turned. Cale stared at her, a hand on his sword. The sword she'd brought to the warehouse. The sword she'd left there. Archer had told her that Cale had known they were going to do this. He had known. She shattered completely and launched herself at him. Cale had only enough time to release his sword as she lunged, swiping for his face with a hand. She slammed him into the wall, and stinging pain burst from the 4 lines she gouged across his cheek with her nails. She reached for the dagger at her waist, but he grasped her wrist. Blood slid down his cheek, down his neck. His guard shouted, rushing closer, but he hooked a foot behind hers, twisting as she shoved, and threw her to the ground. "Stay back," he ordered them, but it cost him. Pinned beneath him, she slammed a fist up beneath his jaw so hard his teeth sang. And then she was snarling like some kind of wild animal as she snapped for his neck. He reared back, throwing her against the marble floor again. Stop. But the Selena he knew was gone. The girl he'd imagined as his wife, the girl he'd shared a bed with for the past week, was utterly gone. Her clothes and hands were caked with the blood of the men in the warehouse. She wedged a knee up, pounding it between his legs so hard he lost his grip on her, and then she was on top of him, dagger drawn, plunging down toward his chest. He grabbed her wrist again, crushing it in his hand as the blade hovered over his heart. Her whole body trembled with effort, trying to shove it in the remaining few inches. She reached for her other dagger, but he caught that wrist too. "Stop," he gasped, winded from the blow she'd landed with her knee, trying to think past that blinding pain. "Selena, stop." This is not fun. "Captain," one of his men ventured. "Stay back," he snarled again. Selena threw her weight into the dagger she held aloft and gained an inch. His arms strained. She was going to kill him. She was truly going to kill him. He made himself look into her eyes, look at that face so twisted with rage that he couldn't find her. "Selena," he said, squeezing her wrist so hard that he hoped the pain registered somewhere, wherever she had gone, but she still wouldn't loosen her grip on the blade. "Selena, I'm your friend." She stared at him, panting through gritted teeth, her breath coming quicker and quicker before she roared, the sound filling the room, his blood, his world. "You will never be my friend. You will always be my enemy." She bellowed the last word with such soul-deep hatred that he felt it like a punch to his gut. She surged again, and he lost his grip on the wrist that held the dagger. The blade plunged down and stopped. There was a sudden chill in the room, and Selena's hand just stopped, as though it had been frozen in midair. Her eyes left his face, but Cale couldn't see who it was she hissed at. Oh God. Oh, sorry, my phone's dying. Oh. Her eyes left his face, but Cale couldn't see who it was she hissed at. Sorry. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if she was thrashing against some invisible force, but then Ress was behind her, and she was too busy struggling to notice as the guard slammed the pommel of his sword into her head. As Selena fell atop him, a part of Cale fell along with her. Well. Wait, what part? Oh, God. This is not fun. How are we feeling? I'm feeling like I don't want to read this anymore. I'm feeling like I don't want to read this series anymore. You know, at first it was fun. It was fun. I had a good laugh. Y'all gave me a good, some entertainment. It was fun. I was having fun. And then y'all killed Sam. And then I wasn't having fun. And then I had fun again. We were doing the duel. We had Dorian. Then we had Kale. And things were great. And now I'm not having fun again. You're not allowed to stop until after Queen of Shadows. This is not fun. This is not fun for me. No fun in this house. Literally, yes, I'll have fun again, and then she's gonna hurt me again. So I don't want to have any more fun. Oh God. It gets better, and then it'll get worse. I know. I've been reading y'all's comments about, what is it, KOA, Kingdom of Ash. I've seen y'all talk about how that book destroyed you. I don't want that. I wish, honest to God. I don't believe in God. Anyway, honestly, I would have rather read this series before A Court of Thorns and Roses, because you know what? I went into this series, my expectations were so good, so good. I really did think that we were going into this series very much like A Court of Thorns and Roses, because that was the only thing that I knew about SJM, was A Court of Thorns and Roses. And so when I started reading this, I was like, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a cute little quirky book series. I'm gonna rip it. I'm so mad. And that's not what I got. Ugh. And then I want to read Crescent City, but now I don't know if I want to read Crescent City, because if Crescent City is sad, like this has been sad, I don't want to read it. Yeah, I'm sure it has a good ending. She has to give Selena a good ending for the shit that she's been putting her through. This bitch has been through more in the past 3 books that I've been reading than any main character ever has for any other book series that I've ever read. Sam doesn't die in Crescent City. Crescent City made me cry for real. There you go. That right there, I'm not reading it. I'm not reading it. And then I'm sad because now Selena is not gonna want Kale, like, at all. Like, I had prophesized that it would happen, but honestly, I think I would have preferred if she just killed him, because she basically did by doing this. Like, she basically killed Kale by doing this. He's dead to her now. She's not gonna fucking want to be with him. He's dead to her. No, we need Kale. And now I'm sad because Kale didn't know what he was doing. Like Kale didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know they were gonna kill her. That's gonna eat him up for the rest of his life. And I don't think he deserves that. I didn't like him at the beginning, but I don't think he deserves to live with that. Like, I feel really bad for him. I feel badly for him. I feel like he got the short end of the stick. Well, maybe if he was more like Sam, he wouldn't be in this situation. You and me are just the biggest Sam simps, the biggest Sam stans ever, and I live for it. You're the only one that will let me rant without end over how much I love and miss Sam. No one ever feels bad for him. But it's just like, but No, he didn't. Okay, if he knew that they were going to kill her, like for real, then I wouldn't feel bad for him. But he didn't, y'all. He didn't know. How can y'all hold that against him? The poor baby. He didn't know they were gonna do that. If he were more like Sam, he'd be dead. That was out of pocket. Stop it! Stop! The king told him not to say anything. It wasn't. Oh, yeah, but because he should have known. Yeah, that's so unfair. But he was too caught up because he should have known. Yeah, that's so unfair. But he was too caught up in. Piss it. What the heck? Why does it go back and forth whenever I click that button? He's just a child playing at being a warrior. Dang, Sarah, go in on him, I guess. But yeah, alright. Well, I guess I will see y'all. I did handle that better than Sam's death. I think because I was prepared for it this time. Because I will see y'all. I did handle that better than Sam's death. I think because I was prepared for it this time. Because I will see y'all. I did handle that better than Sam's death. I think because I was prepared for it this time. Because I. Okay. Anyway, I detached myself from that scene. So I read it, but I didn't really read it. Like, I wasn't here for it. Perks of disassociation. Alright. Well, I guess I will... Wait, what are y'all talking about? Out of body experience? No, literally. She's about to choke Dorian. I was scared for Dorian. I was scared for his life for a second. He pulled a sword on her. Okay, he didn't... I don't think he really pulled a sword on it. He pulled a sword on her. Okay, he didn't... I don't think he really pulled a sword. Goodbye. Oh, there he is. There we are. I'm just gonna end the live now because my internet's being wonky. Probably because I've been live for like 3 hours. So, I love y'all. See y'all tomorrow.